Everybody's got their own tolerance level for how complex they want a game engine to be. In fact, many of us have a different preference depending on the game. The current trend, and I assume the trajectory that games are on in general, is that there's beauty in simplicity. Things are more fun when they require less concentration than things in real life. Don't make a player roll dice twice when just one dice will do. I made a video about that. Don't make a player track encumbrance because there's too much paperwork. I made a video about that. Design rules so a newcomer can start playing the game within 15 minutes of reading the rule book. I've got lots of videos about that. As someone who likes to teach people new things, I agree with this design choice strongly. I really do. I admire it and I enjoy it. But as a gamer, sometimes I'm not always on the side of simplicity. And here are 3 reasons why. First, I think many of us have different tolerance levels for complexity depending on the subject. So you might rage quit a game that forces you to, refer to 3 different tables and 2 different dice rolls to calculate whether or not you managed to pierce the heavy plate armor of the Green Knight, but happily spend hours playing an economy simulator that has you tracking the current price of red gemstones based on your negotiations with the Dwarven Labor Union. Even more confusingly, you might rage quit the game about combat with the Green Knight, but then embrace a complex game about space battles just because for you it's more fun to endure the tedium of flying an imaginary spaceship than it is to endure the tedium of hitting a guy in a tin can with a sharp stick. It's confusing, it doesn't make any sense, but that's okay. That we're human, we're allowed to do that. We can be contradictory, it's fine. Gaming is a hobby. Nobody has an obligation to be consistent or logical in what they find entertaining. Sometimes I enjoy an quote-unquote over-complex game. Other times I don't. It makes no sense. This is in defense of the arguably over-complex games that I do enjoy. 1. Complexity can express complexity. Some things in life are complex. Disarming a time bomb, for example, is something that most of us will hopefully never have to do in real life, but it's a nice dramatic trope, so let's use it. In a game about disarming time bombs, you'd probably want the action of disarming the bomb to have a specific feeling. It ought to feel stressful, even though players know that failing to disarm the imaginary time bomb actually has no real consequence. It ought to feel like a highly specialized activity, so that players feel they're the experts in the game world, and even though they're the experts, it's not easy, it's difficult, but they're getting through it. It ought to feel delicate, like one wrong move could trigger disaster. Now, in a simple game, you could just have a player roll dice and maybe add, their explosives skill. Roll 10 or better on a d20 or a 4+ on a d6 or whatever, and you've disarmed the bomb. You've won. But in a complex game, maybe there's some randomly generated clues within the time bomb itself. As the player, you have to interpret the clues to determine the quickest avenue to deactivation. The clue you follow determines the sequence of dice rolls required, and you only have a limited pool of explosive skill points to use to increase or decrease each roll. For some parts of the time bomb, the game even teaches you some basic electronics, so you can calculate resistance along some of the circuits and read an in-game voltmeter so you can find out which wire feeds the trigger signal between the clock and the explosive. If you mess up, you can start back at the beginning, but then the time bomb's timer advances one step closer to detonation. Both of these games are imaginary. I've never played anything like either of those, but one is obviously more complex than the other. Tabletop games being what they are, it's entirely possible for you, as long as you have imagination, to walk away from the simple version feeling like you've actually disarmed a time bomb. However, your memory of that game experience isn't likely to be procedural. You're likely to remember the stress associated with the problem, and you might have a mental image of the imagined scenario, but you won't remember the work you actually did because you just rolled a dice once. The complex version of the scenario gives you memories of the work you did to achieve your goal. It's still imaginary because you weren't really disarming a bomb, but your brain was authentically engaged. You had to make choices, choices, you had to balance the good and the bad luck you experienced when rolling dice, you had to think about circuit design and voltage and how a bomb might be designed to explode when a clock hits a specific point on the clock, probably because that's when the signal stopping it from exploding is disconnected, unless it's being controlled by a microcontroller, in which case maybe a pulse is sent out at some specific moment, and so on. Lots of thoughts had to go through your head to win that game, and all that brain activity implants a healthy set of memories and emotions. I mean, I guess I'm not a neurologist, but that's, in my experience, that's been true. 2, ritual complexity. Lecturer and podcaster John O. Bacon had a great story about a story of a woman who was making afternoon tea. Her partner was grumbling about how much of a bother it was to make tea every day, and how an automated teapot would alleviate so much pain. And to that, the woman said, "But I like the pain of making tea." Like preparing for afternoon tea, a complex game with lots of things to track and lots of moves to be made and charts and graphs to consult can be laborious. But another way to look at that labor is as a ritual. Just because something takes time and effort to accomplish, and just because some of the things you do don't necessarily have a good reason for being done, it doesn't mean it's painful. On the contrary, it can be comforting. When you play a complex game that you enjoy, you take joy in exercising muscle memory, in seeing familiar cards or player tokens or character sheets, in adding to your version of the game's lore or whatever. I think many people might consider Pathfinder adventure card game complex. Got a lot of games that I've played on this channel of that. But the rules are ingrained in my memory now, and I play it frequently, despite only having the original boxed set with no valid expansions. And I find it better the more I play it. It's comforting to experience and re-experience. I discover more and more nuance the more I repeat its processes. I can imagine a simpler version of the game, with fewer stats to refer to and maybe fewer dice rolls, maybe an easier way to track new abilities and so on. And that might even be a good game, but it wouldn't be the same game. 3, the crunch is the game. Complexity is a matter of perspective, which is not to say that a complex game isn't actually complex, but that sometimes I think people misunderstand why a complex game is complex. You might think a complex game is just poorly designed, and the game designer just didn't get the memo that we're in the 21st century now, and that game rules ought to be minimal. To be fair, that is sometimes true, but usually a complex game I enjoy is complex because it's viewing the game from a specific perspective. Imagine a game where the win condition is to get your player token from point A to point Z. In a simple game, you could, for instance, roll a d6. On a 1 to 3, you don't move. On a 4 to 6, you do move. You probably achieve your goal after 2 or 3 tries. How can we make that more complex? Well, we could say that the same rules apply, except that when you fail, so you roll 1 to 3, you still do move. You move from point A to point B or to C or D or whatever, and so on until you do eventually reach point Z. But on a successful roll, maybe you get to skip some points, or you get to re-roll, or maybe you roll several dice, but certain numbers explode so you can keep rolling. The fun of the simple game is the moment of surprise when you roll favorably after several failures. The fun of the complex game is in the incremental progress and what form it takes. For somebody who enjoys a complex game, maybe the most fascinating part of the game is the final form the path to success ends up taking, the pattern of good rolls and bad rolls. Getting a good first roll in the simple game is exciting, but in the complex game, what's really exciting is that yesterday it was good, good, bad, good, good, bad, and today it was bad, bad, good, good. And notice that there is an interpretation of this example whereby the simple game is not simple and the complex game is simple, because the complex game, at least this iteration of it, this example of it, the complex game encourages progress, while the simple game allows for lots of failure. Now, that's just in this example, and that's not universally true. Not all simple games sort of reinforce failure, and not all complex games reinforce progress. I'm just saying that if you look at this differently, you could reinterpret even the quote-unquote complex rules as actually being a simple game, because no matter what, the player senses progression. That was just an aside. Let's talk about some other examples. In the Middle-earth strategy battle game, each attack requires a dice roll to determine whether you've hit, a chart to determine the defense of your target against your weapon once you have hit, and then another dice roll to determine whether your hit has caused damage according to that chart. That's 2 rolls and 1 chart for a simple attack. There are obviously lots of other games out there that handle combat completely differently, but that's one example. Mansions of Madness, I've played that on this channel, determines a successful hit and the damage all with 1 roll, or the damage is actually decided by the app, but it's just 1 roll. Fallout, the board game, determines not just the hits you deal, but also the hits you take in 1 roll on specialty dice. In other words, the definition of complexity kind of depends on context. It might feel like something is overcomplex until you look at what's trying to be achieved or expressed. If your goal is to remove an orc from the battlefield in your game, it could be done pretty easily. You require a dice roll, and upon success, you remove the orc. You're done. But if your goal is to simulate the process of removing an orc from the battlefield, then doing it with a single dice roll is missing the point. Arguably, you may as well just skip the dice roll and remove 50% of your enemy, because it's going to happen eventually. The game is the dice roll, the chart consultation, the other dice roll, and whatever else. It's the realization in the moment that you're not going to be able to take this orc out by yourself, at least not with that little short sword you've got. But maybe you could chip away a couple of its hit points to soften it up, and then move out of range so that a more powerful player character can move in and get that orc off the battlefield. If you leave that up to a single dice roll, then all you know by the end is that the dice didn't do what you wanted it to do, which is fine, but it's also not the same experience. In some games, complexity isn't a hurdle to overcome in order to play the game, it is the game. So don't get me wrong, I do think there's a lot of value in designing simple games. Believe me, I really appreciate them. There's value in designing quick start rules that enable players to play like a simplified version of a game with just enough complexity to give them an idea of whether they'd like to learn more. There's value in designing a game that starts out simple and then adds complexity through in-game items. And there's also value to just admitting that sometimes you do want a complex, crunchy game that takes an hour to get through 1 round. It isn't for everyone. It's not even for every occasion. But then again, what game is? Thanks for watching.